I wanted to bring today's episode to the podcast talking all about functional genetics. When you're in the fertility journey, you may be told there's nothing you can do if you have low AMH or high FSH, diminished ovarian reserve, premature ovarian insufficiency. Maybe you're being pushed to IVF, being told it's donor eggs. But we need to look at your genetics and what are the specific diet and lifestyle and supplement recommendations we can do to really support your body so you can improve your chances of a successful pregnancy. This is a very empowering episode. We've included functional genetic testing as part of our program for years, and we're doing a deep dive into some testing that can really have us looking at specific gene variants and then what we can do to improve pregnancy. So excited for you to listen. Let's go. Hey, Dr. Shay, I'm excited to have you on the podcast.
Hey, great to be here.
Can you share with us your journey of really how you got here?
Sure. So the short version was very sick as a child. What started since my earliest memories at age 6, I was sickly, and there are many reasons for that. One is I believe I only found out 2 years ago that I've had Lyme disease the whole time. The other is that my parents had a nuclear divorce when I was 6 years old, and me and my sisters were caught in the blast radius, and they didn't do it right. They were leveraging the children against each other. There was tremendous amount of resentment, and it was very clear to me that I was a burden and dead weight to my parents that wanted to just restart their lives. And then the school system was violent, and no one protected me, and I developed crippling insomnia. I couldn't get to stay asleep well, and I woke up super early. It was very choppy, and it's actually stunted my growth. I was an insomniac from 6 to 18. And even though, despite my foot size and hand size and my father's height, I should be 4 to 6 inches taller than I am, but I'm not. So then I had severe digestive problems, lots of anxiety and depression. I was in chronic spinal pain from violence that no one seemed to take seriously, and I just thought pain was normal. And I coped with a video game and sugar addiction as well. And in high school, I decided to pivot to natural medicine and to take charge of my health. Whereas both my parents were psychiatrists, and they thought all my problems were an SSRI deficiency, as opposed to dealing with nutrition, lifestyle, and just basic social support and basic parenting skills on their part. And I was fed a terrible diet because they were psychiatrists in the 80s and 90s, and they knew absolutely nothing about nutrition. So I was supposed to be a third generation medical doctor. My grandfather on my father's side was a very famous medical doctor. He was the founding director of the Fels Cancer Research Center in 1937. Published over 300 articles. And my father, two-time author and MacArthur recipient. My mother, also a medical doctor, a psychiatrist who traversed all the different fields of psychiatry. So I thought then I just pivoted to natural medicine, and then became very focused on neurology in chiropractic school. Later on, got an acupuncture degree, and then studied with an osteopath for 7 months, and then got very heavy into functional medicine, functional testing, and then especially in the past 8 years, functional genetics. And so right now, functional genetics is my primary focus. And for me, figuring out my own personal genetics, I realized that one of the reasons I was in so much pain, and I'd continue to be into pain into my 30s, like chronic joint pain, like an old man, was because I realized genetically I was hyper-inflammatory. Genetically, I was prone to hyperinflammation. And so taking my little gram of fish oil every day for years didn't do anything, because it was just adding some widgets to the machinery, whereas much higher concentrations of specific nutrients and specific lifestyle changes are required for what's called nutrigenomic changes, where I don't just throw widgets into the machinery like a gram of fish oil, but actually change the machinery. Like higher concentrations of fish oil can actually change the genetic expression. So that's one example of the things I did when I got my genetics report back to get rid of my joint pain. I also learned that I was eating the wrong diet the entire time. And genetically, I'm actually much better suited to a paleo bordering on keto diet, where I was in like a perfect Portlandia Mediterranean diet where I knew the names of my farmers and their chickens, and the quinoa was grown by left-handed monks and on the last harvest moon and all this other stuff. It wasn't a quality issue of carbs, it was a quantity issue. And I didn't know that till I ran my genetics. I also learned from my genetics that I am hypersensitive to caffeine, to the where I get what's called caffeine-induced anxiety and depression. And a lot of people don't realize that they have caffeine-induced anxiety and depression. It doesn't matter how bulletproof your coffee is. I had the most bulletproof coffee ever. It's practically Kevlar coffee. I should probably trademark that name. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I was getting anxious mess, and I was confusing anxiety for energy. I also learned that I had really deep problems absorbing vitamin D, not synthesizing it from the sun, but actually bringing vitamin D from the blood into the cells, which had a massive correlation to. I mean, when I went back and looked at all my clients, everyone with only one exception who had double red dots or really bad versions of the vitamin D receptor genes had chronic illness. The exception was someone who had crushing, life formative, changing stress in their life, which drove them into chronic illness. I mean, that will do that. If it's bad enough, it'll happen to anyone. But that's the only person I saw in my practice who did not have a variant in their vitamin D receptors, but still had chronic illness. It was had to do with the demise of their child, which is probably the most stressful thing anyone can deal with as a parent. And so that was understandable. And then I went back and checked with the lead scientist who created the tests, and I was like, "Look, this is a pattern I see. Do you see this in the database and in your other top practitioners who run a bunch of these tests?" And he came back to me and says, "Yes, there is a pattern." And so when I looked at my genes, I was able to understand that one, there's other things that massively improved my life, but those are kind of the highlights. But what I learned from genetics was, one, why I was unwell, because I had a uniquely bad role of inflammatory and other genes, but I had the environmental situation that exposed those bad genes with the bad diet, the high stress, the sleep deprivation. And I know other people who've had, similar, maybe not identical, but they were never as sick as I was. And that's because those environmental inputs were translated through my uniquely bad genetics. And the good news is that the genetics tests that I do, they're not, "Oh, you have bad genes, sorry, you just got to resign yourself to nihilistic, fatalism, and you have bad genes, just give up now." No, I only look at genes you can do something about that are practical. And so now I know what to do. And now I don't have joint pain. My diet's better. Like in my 40s, I have never been healthier in my whole life. I have never been healthier than I have been in my whole life now. And a huge portion of that was due to figuring out what my unique genetics were. And so, and then as it relates to, the context of this podcast with fertility, is that I know for a fact that long-term health begins with the fertility process. And whether it's the resilience of the parents to help raise the child without getting burnt out and sleep deprived and deficient, to the actual help of, the quality of egg and sperm, the development of the fetus, to, the birth and growth and development of the child. And the earlier that we can help in optimizing the resilience and health of every step of the way, the less problems and the better quality of life there'll be going forward.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. A lot of our, pain to purpose kind of story, right? Where we discover all this stuff and go, wait a minute, there's things we can do. And it's not just like we're doomed because we've got this, genetic predisposition with epigenetics. And we're going to talk about the functional genetic testing. There's targeted steps we can take. And, we've had genetic testing as part of our method for years. And so I've done some, a number of podcasts on that, but I wanted to dig deeper with this one because you've got some testing that you're recommending, and we're gonna share one of the reports that you have here. And so a lot of people that are on the fertility journey, we're working with people that have diminished ovarian reserve, low AMH. They typically been told that donor eggs are their only option, or they have to rush to IVF. Maybe they have premature ovarian insufficiency, high FSH as well, and then and they're sort of feeling that there's nothing they can do. And then they may have had, so they might have got the genetic testing if they have POI for Turner syndrome or Fragile X. Most people we're working with don't have that. So there's no genetic issues here, but they might have had some karyotyping or some genetic testing done at their fertility clinic. So this genetic testing that we're talking about is a lot different than that. So
Very
let's just
different.
let's talk about the difference and really why, this is empowering, how you can make those targeted diet and lifestyle changes. And like even just back to the vitamin D. So studies with low vitamin D and low AMH, right? Your immune system being low. And then maybe that's why the AMH is low to begin with. And so we've got people, and also some of the seeing that in black and white in your genetic testing going, oh, wait, there's a reason, there's things I can do. So what are you seeing with the difference between the tests?
So there's different types of genetics testing. And so you're talking about, anti-Müllerian hormone testing or all these different karyotypes and all these things, like that is utterly completely relevant, totally relevant to the fertility journey. And if people are interested in genotyping to figure out like what percentage Irish you are, like, sure, great, that's interesting too, and it may be relevant if you are concerned about different percentages of risk of certain diseases that certain lineages are prone to. That's also important. The type of testing that I'm looking at are not that. What it is, it's looking at instead the foundational health-based genes that are important for anyone, that are important no matter if you're trying to get pregnant or not. And what this means is that people can do this particular genetics test whether they're trying to get pregnant or not. And the original tests were not even for fertility. They've just developed a special fertility profile that's specific to people interested in fertility. But originally, it was never about fertility. It was about identifying the drivers of all disease. It was never looking for a disease gene. It was looking for what were the genes that were the control switches that, if they got provoked, would then downstream poke on disease genes. So most people were looking for, oh, is this the cancer gene, the heart disease gene, the stroke gene, the dementia gene, the diabetes gene, or even the infertility gene. It's not looking for a specific disease gene. It's looking at the drivers. So the main drivers are, number one is inflammation, shocker. The next one is free radical damage scavenging in the mitochondria, where 95% of all the free radicals are made. Then there's the liver detox genes. Then there's the vitamin D receptor genes. Then there's the methylation genes, of which there are about a dozen to 2 dozen, not just MTHFR. Then there's the cardiovascular circulation genes, and then there's the genes that control fat and energy metabolism. And they're in a rank order hierarchy. So the inflammation, so not all genes are created equal, because the inflammatory genes actually are superordinate to the rest. And in fact, I'll give an example. I'm sure you heard that, Gary Brecka went on Joe Rogan and talked about his magic 5 gene test for methylation. I was literally screaming into my phone. I was so upset at his oversimplification. Now, he's a great instructor. Like he's great at teaching, interesting view as basically an actuary terrible person for health insurance. Like, fascinating dude. Like, I don't knock him one bit for his ability to teach and simplify, but he radically oversimplified. And I basically went on a podcast rampage. I did 3 separate podcasts for an hour debunking his 5 precious genes, showing the papers that inflammation controls methylation. As one example, like he's fixating downstream when you should be looking upstream. You can look at this, but don't ignore this. His thing is that these 5 are the things you need is categorically wrong. It's important, but they're not the most important things, not by a long shot. So if you understand that genes are in a hierarchy, that's really good news, because that means when you run a genetics report, you don't have to look at 1,000 genes or even 500 or even like 300. You can look at about 100, 150, and even those are rank ordered. So that means is that you can pick the lifestyle, diet, nutrition changes that are most important to the highest priority genes first. So you don't have to change 300 things about your lifestyle. You can change 5 to 10, and in order of priority. So it's much more practical and much more winnable and way less overwhelming than other genetics reports. So that's the foundation of where this particular gene test came from. It's not looking at all of the genes. It's looking at only the ones that are one, a part of these seven drivers of chronic disease. Then there's are these of those genes, are they upstream? Do they, because there's a couple hundred genes that control inflammation directly or indirectly. I want to look at the top 15 of those, not all hundreds of them. And then I want to know of those genes, which have at least 10% variation in the general public. So I'm not looking for the super, super, super obscure genes, which is important for people that have those super obscure genes with the variations. But that's a more of a specialist genetic test than the ones that I'm looking at. And then the fourth criteria is of those genes, which ones have peer-reviewed studies done on humans, not wombats or nematodes, to show that lifestyle and diet and nutrition alone will change the epigenetic expression of the genes, whether they're a red or yellow dot, into so they can behave more green-like. They will never become green, but they will behave more green-like. So those are the four criteria to distill down to the fewest number of most important genes as it relates to global health and well-being. And then from that report, then came these other side reports, including fertility, exercise, immunity, food triggers, food and behavior, how genes affect your eating behaviors. And then another test, which is unique to this company as well, that looks at what is your optimal diet? Are you keto, paleo, Mediterranean, or high carb, or some shade of gray in between? And it is not looking at variations. It's looking at copy numbers. It's looking at the duplicates of the gene, not the version of the gene. And that's a complete three-dimensionality to genetics testing that very few people know about, much less talk about, much less can actually do something with practically. And it's the number of duplicates of this particular gene that breaks down carbohydrates that's way, way, way more important than the version of the gene that determines are you keto, paleo, Mediterranean, high carb, or some shade of gray in between. And you can't get that from a 23andMe or an ancestry because they only look at variations. They're not looking at the number of duplicates of the gene. So there's a lot in this particular style of health and well-being genetics testing that regardless if you're trying to get pregnant or not, you're going to derive lifetime value for your entire lifestyle, diet, and nutrition. And also, there is a fertility specific distillation of these reports. If people are uniquely concerned about fertility, there's eyes on that. And so I'm happy to show the general health and well-being, or I can just start with the fertility report because that's it's what people are tuning in. And then we can go backwards into and kind of zoom out to the bigger issues. I mean, it's up to you. You know your audience better than I do.
Yeah, so obviously everyone here they're wanting to get pregnant. We want to hear to improve pregnancy outcomes and also being able to reduce the risk of preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, obviously with autism on the rise. So let's look at the fertility report and see what we can, because it is about the tweak. Like a lot of times people are doing some of these generalized recommendations. And then we think, hey, we've done this generalized diet, we've done this generalized lifestyle piece. It's not working. Oh, I got to go to IVF. No, this is where we go deeper and taking a targeted approach with this, which doesn't waste time because you can do, they're selling IVF in packages of 3 where people are going off and doing, and it's still not working. They're getting canceled cycles and, it's being a poor responder. And maybe they needed support with their methylation, support with their, if you've got inflammation, if your CRP is up, like things like that. So let's share this. So we're sharing, if you're following us on YouTube, we're sharing this obviously on Spotify.
What are you seeing on the screen right now? Are you seeing
the personal genetic profile. Yeah. So let's go.
Here's the 13. So here's the 13 components that are looked at specifically around fertility optimization. So the first one is folate and homocysteine metabolism, the genetics of folate and homocysteine. Then there's the genetics of choline, the genetics of B6, vitamin A, zinc, vitamin C, a kind of a cluster of other nutrients, estrogen metabolism, progesterone metabolism, testosterone metabolism, other reproductive hormones, which I'll show down lower, thyroid and melatonin. So this report is focusing on these 13 categories of metabolism. How does that match your general list of things to look at?
That's great.
Okay, awesome. So then okay, so this page is just showing like the green, yellow, red dot. I think that this audience is very familiar with those designations. The green type is, two good copies from, one good copy, air quotes, good copy from mom, one from dad. Yellow is one bad copy, one good copy from either parent, and the red copy is a bad copy each. And so when we're going into fertility, the first stop we're looking at is at methylation. And so the most famous ones, MTHFR1 and MTHFR2, it wouldn't be a report on fertility if it didn't at least talk about this. And so it's talking about, are people having issues with high homocysteine levels and increased risk of low folic acid based on the gene variations with MTHFR. Then we've got PMT, which is looking at choline metabolism, and how, like, if people are, choline is super important for pregnancy. There's no really other way to say it. And they also look at the MT. There's also MT. Certain people also have the MTH FD1 also as a gene available to look at. And this person has a yellow dot, and what that means is they have problem with choline metabolism. And so we're looking at, for this person, now you can test, just to be clear, and I'm sure your people, listeners know, there's doing the genetics testing, and then there's doing functional testing. So genetics testing is different from like the blood test to see what your choline levels are now, what your vitamin A levels are now, what your folate levels are now, your B12, your homocysteine. So genetics is telling you how to live optimally for the long term and where the fault lines you've inherited that you have to shore up. Whereas the functional tests, the blood test, stool, urine, saliva, the ones that are checking for hormones and nutrition, that's a thumbprint into what is happening now. What is the actual amount of the thing now, the actual amount of the hormone, the amount of the mineral, the amount of the vitamin, the amount of the marker. Genetics doesn't tell you the amount you have now. It tells you the probabilities and the directions in which things are going to show up. It's not the thumbprint. So both ideally are done together, but they're just different windows into the physiology. So you can get tested for choline. And then things that you can do for higher choline are, liver, egg yolks, and cauliflower are usually the top three that are mentioned. And then there's food things you can do for folate. And then for B6 is another set of three genes. This is the NBPF3, which, I mean, you talk about a mouth. You can win a Scrabble tournament if you want a first name basis with these acronyms. Get ready for this one. NBPF3. That stands for the neuroblastoma breakpoint family number 3. And I don't know how they named these things, but I'm glad they shortened it to NBFP3. So this is, in long and short of it, this is about B6. And then there's the ALPL1 and 2 genes, which is alkaline phosphatase, and also about B6. And there's an idea of like nutritional intervention and nutrigenomic, and these are two terms that are important to understand. Nutritional interventions are, the gene has a variation, and the solution that is known based on the research as we know it is we just have to give that nutrient that they're likely to be low in, because either they need more of it to make it work, or they just need more of it because they lose it more. They somehow can't synthesize it, or they excrete it more frequently, or whatever it is. So nutritional is, okay, we need to replace the missing nutrient. We can't actually change the genetic propensity to maintain the level of the nutrient. Nutrigenomic means that you do a lifestyle intervention, nutritional intervention that may not be the nutrient in question. Like to increase your vitamin D absorption, you don't necessarily give more vitamin D. You give other things like sulforaphane to increase the expression of the gene to then help you absorb more of the vitamin D. Nutrigenomic means you give a nutrient, or you do a lifestyle intervention where you change the gene's behavior, where you now increase the access to the nutrient in question. or you increase the enzyme that helps the processing of that nutrient in question. So some of these genes, it relates to fertility, do not have any known nutrigenomic things where you can't do anything to change the expression of the red dot to make it behave more like a green dot. It's more like, hey, you can only do nutritional interventions, so pay attention to these specific genes related to these nutritional markers, and you want to focus your blood testing and your diet stuff here because you're kind of stuck where you can't do anything necessarily to help the gene behave better. So that's into nutritional nutrigenomic testing. And I saw that when in this fertility report, there's certain genes that were added that are really important for fertility, but actually don't have nutrigenomic interventions. They just have nutritional interventions. And I mean, I'm sure as science develops, we'll get more and more data, but not all genes can be nudged in towards behaving more green-like. In the original health and well-being panel that was originally designed years ago based on those 4 criteria I described earlier, all of those have nutrigenomic interventions that you can change the behavior of the genes. But in the creation of the fertility report, they're definitely important genes that unfortunately don't have nutrigenomic interventions, but they can focus your nutritional eyes on it. So so we talk about B6. Any questions on that before I go on to the other list of genes we're looking at?
Yeah, like to me, it does, obviously there's some that if you've got, you're not able to make some changes, but with what was I going to say, with like it just helps with behavioral change where we can see this for our specific biology and what we need to do. So then you're like, oh, there's a reason why maybe either I'm avoiding eggs or not avoiding, obviously if there's sometimes we see people obviously with they're pounding down all kinds of eggs and they're intolerant to white. So sometimes we need to take it out and then we can supplement. But it becomes a very personalized approach because there's so much in this, specifically in this fertility realm, with a lot of generalized recommendations of you do this, do that, and a whole, top fertility superfoods, teas, herbs.
I call that bell curve biochemistry.
Right.
I call it bell curve biochemistry, where according to the generalized science, on average, this is good for people in the bell curve. But no one is a singular bell curve. We're about hundreds of different bell curves across all these different genes and other markers. So, like, I totally agree with you that there's generalized recommendations that in general can help generally, but sometimes they generally don't, and they generally can backfire.
That's right. Whereas this helps to fast track it so you can just
Correct.
pinpoint it and move along. And with fertility being time of the essence, this is when we don't want to mess around. This is why we have genetic testing and why, you use genetic testing as well, so we can pinpoint it. Okay, what else do you have going on here on the report?
Sure. So we got vitamin A, and so vitamin A, and this is actually something I'm asking around right now to geneticists and other people in the research. That my understanding is that I studied Dr. Weston A. Price's nutritional work since I was 20, so it's been over 20 years, and I know from Dr. Weston A. Price's anthropological work that all these cultures prize the highest concentration fat soluble vitamin foods, even though they didn't know them by those names. They were going for organ meats and like the darkest orange butter from cows that ate the freshly growing green grass in the first spring, and eggs and all these. And they were really, and liver, they were really high in natural vitamin A. And so, I mean, it's a question I would have for you. Like, I think I believe the research on vitamin A showing the dangers of it was done more on synthetic vitamin A as opposed to natural vitamin A. Am I wrong on that?
If I can comment on that at this stage, I don't know at this stage.
Okay. So this kind of it's an open question. And in regards to this gene, this is the gene that's called beta carotene monoxygenase, and it helps with converting beta carotene into vitamin A. So people that have a red or yellow dot in this don't convert beta carotene so readily into vitamin A. So what that means is that obviously, like, you're wanting to get your vitamin A levels checked, and you don't want to go too high. But there are people genetically that, just slamming carrots isn't going to work. And the reason why people's skin can turn yellow from eating too much carrots or having too much carrot juice is because the beta carotene can't be converted, and the body just throws it into the skin because it's got to store it somewhere. And that's why people turn orange, is because they can't convert it fast enough for the amount you're consuming. So there is a major genetic component there. There's many things that help convert beta carotene to vitamin A, but genes are part of that. Then further down, we've got, shouldn't skip anything here. No, I didn't skip that. Okay. Then further down, we've got zinc. So zinc, super important for, obviously, not only for germ cell growth, fertility, and pregnancy, but like super critical for male fertility. And there's four genes we look at around zinc. And the reality is that there's not really any nutrigenomic things. When I interviewed the geneticist over in Australia about this, I asked her, I was like, okay, are there any nutrigenomic things we can do about zinc metabolism, or is it all nutritional? By nutritional means like check zinc, take zinc, and also don't drink alcohol or anything else that would inhibit absorption of nutrients. And some people will say, well, isn't doing lifestyle things to improve absorption nutrigenomic? No, it's second order nutritional. You're actually helping absorbing the nutritional things. You're not actually changing the gene expression. So it's like a lifestyle things that doing lifestyle changes help with absorption of nutrients. That's not nutrigenomic. You're not changing the expression of the genes per se. So at this point, there aren't any nutrigenomic interventions to change how the zinc expresses itself, to my knowledge or to their knowledge. But if people have these genes and they've got clusters of red and yellow, then you'd want to pay attention to your zinc levels and monitor them much more closely. Same thing with vitamin C. There's not a nutrigenomic intervention to upregulate these enzymes in a way we want. But if you have variations in vitamin C, then you would check vitamin C levels and also check the markers of vitamin C utilization, like 8-OHDG if you're checking organic acids or other antioxidant marker or other oxidation markers.
Maybe, yeah, talk about the immune system too, because a lot of people that are on the fertility journey, typically it's not a sick population. They're working, they're doing their thing. It's just, they're not able to, it's not just, but they're not able to conceive, and they're trying everything they can. And they may be feeling like their mood may be off, obviously, because of this is extremely stressful and frustrating. And it can really impact your relationships, your marriage, your partnership,
Absolutely.
all of this piece. And also in the last 4 years, maybe their immune system, maybe they were either had the jab or they were maybe they were ill. So now what we need to do is to boost their immune system. And now we're seeing that the C is off. But like, what are you seeing from immunity?
Well, here we are right here, VDR.
There we go.
Literally the next gene right away was looking at the most important to me, the most important nutrient in the body next to water is vitamin D. And the reason I say that is that 3 to 5% of your entire human genome is directly influenced by vitamin D. That is 1/33 to 1/5 of all your genes. Sorry, 1/33 to 1/20th of all your genes are influenced by one thing, and it's vitamin D. So this is what I'm talking about, the double red vitamin D receptor. I have this. This is not my report, but this is a fertility age females report. And so the red vitamin D receptors. So vitamin D, people think, oh, vitamin D, it helps with bone density. That's actually not the most important job it does. The most important job it does is regulate inflammation and your immune system. That's what vitamin D is really for. And if people have poor abilities to use vitamin D, then their immune system and their inflammation levels are not going to be well regulated. So what this means is that there's 3 ways to get vitamin D into the blood, which is only half the journey. You get it from sunlight, which is determined by how much sun you get, what season, where you are in the world, how much skin's exposed, what time of day, how long you're. There's a bunch of variables. There's a great app called D-Minder, like Reminder, except it's a D-Minder instead of RE-Minder. Wonderful app, brilliant. It actually puts all these variables into a thing, and you can calculate roughly how much vitamin D you're getting based on the sun exposure. And you can get it from sunlight, you can get it from food, and you can get vitamin D from supplements. That's getting it into the blood. That is half the journey. Vitamin D in the blood isn't going to do anything for you. You have to get it from the blood into the cells to then activate on the nucleus to activate those 3 to 5% of your whole genome. The vitamin D receptors, the VDRs, this is what we're looking at. That is the docking site on the surface of the cell to grab the vitamin D as it's floating by the blood and bring it into the cell to then act on the nucleus. That's what the VDRs are for. So if you have a red dot or a yellow dot, you have fewer docking sites on the surface of the cells to grab vitamin D. That's what this means. You can't use it as well. Every cell in the body, with the exception of red blood cells and dead skin cells, have vitamin D receptors. That's how important vitamin D is. So if people are struggling, then what they may, and they have, for example, vitamin D variants. This is the same gene I mentioned before, where I saw correlation with chronic illness and these vitamin D receptors. Then they'll have to do things to upregulate to do nutrigenomically to change the behavior of these red dot genes to make them behave more green-like. They will never be green, but you can make them behave more green-like. Primarily, the things that help those are, one, avoiding smoking. That includes primary, secondary, and tertiary smoking, because smoking will downregulate the VDR genes, and also to avoid pollution, which does the same thing. And then the other thing is sulforaphane, which is a broccoli sprout extract, and those things there's not a lot of stuff that upregulates the VDR genes, and those are the main ones. And so simply taking more vitamin D won't necessarily help as much as you'd think when you actually have to increase the docking sites to use the vitamin D. So that would be kind of this would be the main pillar. This is the main lever I would be pulling to see about if someone is with their immune system was what are they doing with their VDRs.
Yeah, and with people with low AMA, like we're seeing this low vitamin D, we like it's 60 to 80 or higher, but it's people are with it, and single digits, teens, being told it's normal when it's conventionally at 30 is just the wrong advice.
No. So that's taking I mean there's much older versions of the DS of the Merck manual that show like hypervitaminosis D only happens when you're taking, I can't remember the exact number, but it was something like 80,000 units or 100,000 units every day for months in a row. Like, not the, oh no, 2,000 IUs is going to hurt you. Like, this is ridiculous. This is just absolute bonkers. So look at some of the older editions if people are wanting to scavenge. So vitamin D, I mean, that's pretty much all I can say about vitamin D. There are other genes that are in the other report, in the other immunity. There's a whole separate immunity report, and it shows the other roughly half dozen genes that help convert sunlight into vitamin D. And some people just have variations along that pathway that they really can't rely on getting vitamin D from sunlight. So they'll have to rely on food or supplementation. And then talking about immunity, we already talked about vitamin C and zinc and those genes as well. And then TCN2 and FUT2, those have to do with B12 metabolism and transport. And this is also where I am not a fan of veganism, especially when it comes to fertility, because if people have variations in their B12 absorption pathways, they need to have more food-based B12, and that's found in meat products. I mean, and I get people can object to that, but you can object to Mother Nature all you want, and reality is what reality is.
Yeah, it's not to be like, my parents have been vegans for 35 years, right? So we're never going to push anyone to eat meat, but it's like to be able to look at your blood work, look at your genes, and be like, wait a minute, have an open mind to see what we need for our body, because maybe that is just not serving you. I know for my mom that I don't think it serves her, but she's a lot healthier. My parents in their 80s, a lot healthy, been 35 years, right? A lot healthier than their peers, but then there's still some issues with obviously she's supplementing with B12, but other health issues, sort of more on the mood, anxiety, and her thyroid kind of blew out. So some stuff where I'm like, Well, maybe, but if we get married to these ways of doing things, and it's a generalized recommendation that may have worked for someone, and people that we work with on the fertility journey, we see many people with low B12, or sometimes even high, which could be then it actually is low because you're not absorbing it, but
Absorbing, right.
it is a theme that we see with B12 deficiency.
Yeah, and then there's different forms of B12. There's hydroxy B12, adenosine B12, methyl B12, and the worst is cyano B12. And so some people, and this is where also organic acids testing, like through an ion panel or whatnot, that if people have high levels of B12 in the blood, but high levels of methylmalonate in the urine, that means that there's plenty of B12 floating around, but they're not actually using it. And when I see that, then I have to switch the form of B12 into hydroxy or adenylyl B12 or cobalamin. And because not all forms of B12 are equally usable by everybody at all times. So B12 is B12, and then if people have problems with absorption, especially in their distal ileum where B12 is absorbed, then they're going to have problems. Like they may have metabolic issues that are preventing from absorbing B12 simply because they got Crohn's disease or something else. Then they may have problems absorbing B12 also. So like we can spend 5 podcasts just on B12, and which you probably have at some point or will.
Just did a whole blog. Just did a whole blog on B12 because
You did a blog. Okay, there we are.
So yeah.
Good timing. All right.
Anything else you got sort of high level with the report? Anything you want to kind of
high level? So we're also looking at CoQ10 and dealing with free radical damage, scavenging in the mitochondria. Obviously, you need healthy mitochondria for healthy sperm, healthy eggs, and MN, SOD, GPX1, and CAT. These are what I call the 3 janitors inside the mitochondria, because if you burn fuel in the presence of oxygen, like at a campfire, you get sparks, and you got to put out the sparks or things will catch on fire. You don't want to. It's the same thing in the mitochondria. You burn protein, fats, and carbs in the mitochondria in the presence of oxygen. That is literally what's happening. And the problem is you make sparks. These sparks are called free radicals. Free radicals are the sparks that could burn down the entire factory called the mitochondria. So you've got these 3 janitors called MN SOD, who I lovingly call Mr. SOD. Mr. SOD and his 2 sub-janitors, GPX1 and CAT, run around and put out the sparks. And if you've got red and yellow dots, then your janitors are very slow and they can't put out all the sparks. And that's bad because then your factory will catch on fire and that's bad. So there's a bunch of things that can be done to help spur these janitors nutrigenomically, so you can change how they behave. They will always be the red and yellow dots if you have them, but you can change their behavior with specific lifestyle and diet interventions. Then we come down to the CYP genes. These are massive. This is all the genes related to estrogen metabolism and detox and the COMP gene, and like there's a whole this is a whole discussion in and of itself, and understanding how do you help someone with genetic vulnerabilities and how they metabolize estrogen and hormones in general. And then further down, we've got progesterone receptors and how the genes of handling progesterone, genes as it relates to testosterone, so like sex hormone binding globulin, the meiosis 1 in the testes for making sperm, other things that regulate testosterone metabolism. Then you got the FSH and the LH related genes as well to look at. Then going down further, this is thyroid. Thyroid has a huge role in metabolic rate and growth. I mean, there's so much. We have colleagues that their entire podcast is just devoted to thyroid, and
I've done like so many podcasts on thyroid too.
You're a bit thyroided out. You're a bit hypothyroided out. Talking
right,
about
exactly.
Thyroid, right? And developing a metabolic disorder just thinking about thyroid. Isn't that ironic? Anyway, then you got melatonin signaling as well, and melatonin is sleep, energy, metabolism, immune system, anti-inflammatory. Melatonin is one of the most powerful endogenously created anti-inflammatory substances on the planet that we know. Our body makes it. So, and then you've got a summary page of all the different things, and that's just the fertility report, and that's not including like the bigger details of. Can you see this other screen here? Okay, so then there's looking at like I'll just super high level. Here's the top 15 genes, top 15 most important inflammatory genes. This is the same person. And you can see, and don't get for people who are watching, don't get lost in the hexadecimal hieroglyphics here of what genes they are, or the small font here of the words. You just look at the pattern of the 15 genes. There's only 2 green, and there are 7 red and 6, and 6 yellow. So this person is massively pro-inflammatory. And I'm working with her. When I work with her, if she does anything that's pro-inflammatory, diet, lifestyle, whatever, she blimps up. She just puts on water weight. And the reason why is because inflammatory chemicals are damaging to the cells and tissues. So what happens is the body will retain water to dilute toxic, damaging, inflammatory chemicals from touching the cells and hurting them. So this is where inflammatory weight is water weight, because the body is flooding, diluting these damaging inflammatory chemicals to buy the liver and kidneys time to get rid of them. So when people, I call this I have another slide, which it's not easy to access at the moment, but it's called like the muffin test. The muffin test is a quick way to check to see if someone's massively pro-inflammatory. So again, I'm asking this of the listeners and the viewers. How many of you have eaten half a muffin and you put on within 24 hours 1 to 4 pounds? Now, unless that muffin was last year's regifted Christmas fruitcake, it didn't weigh 1 to 4 pounds. So where did the weight come from? It's all the inflammatory, the sugars, the dyes, the conditioners, the preservatives, the weird colors on the sprinkles, the colorings, whatever leached in through the thing that wrapped the muffin. All of that stuff is massively pro-inflammatory, and your body retained water, and that you put on 1 to 4 pounds of water weight to dilute the inflammatory chemicals that you just introduced. And that also, there's some people that if they over-exercise, they put on weight. I spoke at genetics conferences called exercise-induced obesity, and I found the specific genetic clusters, of which many of them were in these 15 genes here on inflammation, that they were hyper-inflammatory and that they had problems detoxing estrogen. And so when they over-exercise, they put on massive amounts of water weight, but then they plugged up their ability to detox estrogen. So then they became overly anabolic, and they started to put on weight hormonally as well.
A lot of this piece is people have known this for years. Hey, I'll have this and experience, weight gain. I can't put it off. And whatever I'm doing all this exercise, that medical gaslighting, being told, no, don't, it's all in your head. There's nothing you can do. Meanwhile, here our genetics are telling us there's something that we can do. And so you have so that's really super helpful. I really appreciate you sharing that with that test. So let's talk about, you have got a free guide here for the listeners, where they can get that at drsamshay.com/genetics. We'll have the link in the show notes. And what can they get there, Dr. Sam?
So they'll get 2 things. One is a free ebook that goes over in detail. Like I talk about the muffin test, I talk about inflammation, I talk about the major genes, those 7 categories of genes that are critical to all chronic diseases. And then there's also a free mini course where there's it's for any type of learner. There's a video for the visual learners. There's audio, an interview for the auditory. There's a checklist for the doers, and there's another ebook in there for the readers specifically on the genetics of optimal diet. And in that, I share the actual food pyramid, which is showing the 5 layers of determining your optimal diet, of which genetics is the foundational layer. Then there's a metabolic layer, then there's a preference layer, then there's an access layer, then there's an earth layer. And it's a model I developed to answer the riddle of, I tried this diet and it didn't work. And then I tried this diet and I tried all the diets and none of them worked. And I figured out the reason why. The reason why is that people genetically have one diet that they're optimized for, but metabolically, they have a metabolic issue that is creating metabolic barbed wire wrapping their genetics. So for example, if I'm genetically more paleo and keto, which means I eat a higher fat diet, but I have a metabolic problem with my gallbladder or my pancreatic lipases or my carnitine shuttle, or my ability to burn fat in the mitochondria, then if I eat fat, it's good for my genetics, but it's bad for my metabolism because my metabolism is broken. So I have to do one set of diet and protocols to deal with the broken metabolism, to defang the barbed wire, so to speak. Then I have to switch over to a different set once that's done to be in my optimal genetics. On the other side, people can be high carb genetically, but then they can also have a candida infection. So they eat high carbs for their genetics, but they feel terrible because of the candida blooming. But if they eat low carbs, it's suffocating the candida, but their genetics are starving. So these are the people that say no diet works for me, at least not long term. Or these are the people that say, hey, I finally got a functional practitioner and we dealt with all the things and I'm on this great diet. It worked great for like 6 months and then the diet stopped working because they dealt with the metabolic layer, but they are not eating properly now for their genetics. So if you so that this that guide will explain all of that. And the very first step I recommend to people is get your genetics tested because that's the foundation. And then if your genetic diet isn't working, then that's absolutely a sign to go see a functional medicine practitioner and get the metabolic tests done to see if your genes are wrapped in metabolic barbed wire. So that those are the things that people get.
Yeah, awesome. So we'll have the link in the show notes for that. And so the good news is there's things we can do to improve the chances of pregnancy outcomes. We don't need to sit back, think that, IVF is our only option. There's things we can do to be empowered. Any final thoughts for us today, Dr. Sam?
I would say that the risk of getting testing is more psychological than metabolic. That people get tests and then they can feel defeated by the results, or they feel and I would say that everyone is born with a particular unique set of gifts and kryptonites. I have a uniquely vast collection of kryptonites genetically, and I have learned it's an and it's not when I got my genetics report, honestly, I cried for an hour because it explained two things. One, why I was so ill, and two, I had a way out. It actually had a battle plan out and it worked. I don't have the joint pain. My diet is way better. I'm so much healthier. But it's like good news, bad news. Bad news. There's things you're not genetically optimized in these specific ways. Good news. There's things you can do. And everyone has that to one degree or another. And this is why I only like to do this particular type of genetics test is because everything is practical. It's not just, you're not going to careen into nihilistic fatalism. You've got things you can do. It's just, and just to understand you're not alone and that everyone's got their pluses and minuses on their genetics. And ultimately, genetics is about empowering you, not deflating you. And that's what I would leave with.